Pride Parade in New York was in 1970, a year after the Stonewall Riots, and it was called the Christopher Street Liberation Day March. Other marches in LA and Chicago also happened that year, and thousands of people attended across the country. Pride parades are rooted in those riots, and for a lot of people, that should always be at the forefront of the way that we go about celebrating Pride. But not for everyone. Now, it's interesting to note that there had been events prior to Stonewall to protest for gay rights. The annual reminder in Philadelphia, for example, but they were all rooted in seeming as normal as possible. They had dress codes where men had to wear suits and ties and women had to wear dresses. The idea was, we're just like you. They held placards saying things like, homosexuals should be judged as individuals. It was very, I'm not like those gays, I'm a good gay. And there had also been spontaneous protests before, outside the Black Cat Tavern in LA, for example. But Stonewall was this turning point. You had the bravery of the people at the fringes of even our community, the queer women of colour, the drag queens, the hustlers, but then you also had people who were in touch with networks of gay and lesbian people who were able to spread the news of what was happening, and people who work for gay publications like The Advocate. We spread that news. Stonewall wasn't just a turning point because it was a turning point because we said it was. So undeniably, Pride parades have roots within these riots, within this protest culture. But is that all they are? And if there are a multitude of things, can those coexist? That is what we're going to try and unpick in this video today. So for some people, the mantra Pride is a protest is like, that's a full sentence. Pride is a protest, end of story, that's it. And for some people, it's the opposite. It's a party, it's a celebration, and that's the end of the sentence and that's it. And these two ideas, this is not new. This isn't a case of like millennials are ruining Pride. You know, it was always been political and now suddenly it's a party. Literally, from the very first year that Pride parades were going on, this was something that people were questioning and complaining about. You know, we had Christopher Street West, which was the West Hollywood kind of pride that was happening in 1970, and that was a complaint because that was organised as well as by activists, by artists, by religious leaders, by social kind of leaders, and had much more of what was like said to be a celebratory vibe, and that was criticised even back then. But here's where those things like maybe clash a little bit, which is that like, is the party in itself political? Like the Queer Liberation Front in the years after Stonewall held gay-ins. Being open and out and yourself, like even today, is still a pretty radical act for a lot of queer and trans people. Other things that we might kind of distinctively say Pride is in its totality is like a community event or a political march, right? There's lots of ideas about what Pride can be kind of in individual strands. You know, is Pride about bringing the community together? Is Pride about fighting for rights? Is it about discussing issues? Is it about sharing history? And like personally, I think that to just condense it down to the very pithy like Pride is a protest ignores some of the kind of things that we need as a community that can't just be settled in that very specific way. However, I think it's pretty idealistic to say that all of these things can peacefully exist together with no friction, particularly with the rise of the sort of party element of Pride culture. This party element often increases the size and therefore the cost of Pride events, and we have some examples of like LGBT community groups being priced out of the parade when they have to pay for a space, which brands then get. And we also have cases like Sheffield Pride, which has gone very hard line that Pride is a celebration and not a protest, and therefore will be able to remove placards that it say are not appropriate to that particular message. They haven't been very specific with like what those guidelines are going to be, but we do know that, for example, you won't be allowed to use swearing on the placards. Increased size and scale and cost also means that, as I mentioned, brands are increasingly being bought into it. So the brands marching thing is a bit of a sticky issue. On the one hand, it's like, is there anything wrong with these brands wanting to support the community? Is there anything wrong with them wanting to support the employees that they have that are LGBTQ+, and which are often the ones who are going to be on the float themselves? But on the other hand, are there any checks and balances to work out, like, are these brands doing, like, supporting their employees the rest of the year? Are Pride actually checking this, or is it just a case of like, you can buy a float, give us the money, and you can have a float? Also, the question is, are brands marching and having floats in Pride different to brands sponsoring Pride? So if brands are sponsoring Pride, are they actually doing more? Are they giving directly to the community? Or are they just trying to get a bigger profile? And do they have any control over the event itself and the messages that can be portrayed there? And I do think that it would be very easy to say, well, like, just don't have brands, but I think that potentially underestimates how much Pride costs. So Brighton actually has a list of like all of its costs on its website, and it is like multiple hundreds of thousands of pounds. At this scale, brand involvement kind of seems inevitable. So if we say we don't want brands, we have to bring down the scale. But if we bring down the scale, that means that there is a barrier to access for people. There's like a cap, there's a limit on the amount of people who can attend. Or they would have to charge people money to attend. So there's kind of a lack of accessibility in both ways. Either you have to be able to afford to come, or you have to be some of the first people to sign up, I suppose, or turn up. And I think it's important to not forget that Pride celebrations often are not just the march itself. Pride London, for example, has like, I'm pretty sure at this point, like hundreds of events that get run under its banner, which are much more small, much more niche, much more specific. There's a lot of intersectional events that get put on, and those just wouldn't be possible without the kind of funding that brands bring in. And if all of the drama around Pride London's finances are to be believed, there's also a lot of restrictions that are put on Pride parades by like local councils and the police in order to make sure that it's safe and also it doesn't disrupt local businesses. Some people, including Peter Tatchell, have pointed out that a lot of these rising costs imposed on Pride don't seem to be equitable to the costs that are imposed on other marches and protests, but they are being. So yeah, I think it's easy to say that brands and corporations should have no place in Pride, but I think ultimately right now that's not possible. I think what we need to do is work out like a way in which we can integrate this cohesively. So is it possible to have brand sponsoring, but also to make sure that the most vulnerable people in our community are taken care of, that the issues are being raised properly? Like, those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. So like, for example, should a certain percentage of places on the march be taken up with activist groups and non-profits? Should a requirement of brands marching be that they have to showcase one of these issues? Is it possible for companies to fund Pride but refrain from the flashy shows of labels and products on their floats? Now, these questions don't necessarily have answers, and I think there's also some sticky issues within sponsorship as well. For example, a lot of Prides are sponsored by alcohol brands. They're some of the first brands that got involved with the Pride movement. And again, on the one hand, it makes sense because bars are often the only places that we can socialise, and bars and alcohol go together pretty well. It seems like a perfect match. But if we're looking at the issue side of things, like, gay people have an increased risk of alcohol dependency and alcoholism. And these are brands that we want to be sponsoring these events. Like, how do we fit this wide-sweeping corporate sponsorship alongside the activists who are trying to deal with this issue in the first place? And I think that people are coming up with small scale solutions. So we often have smaller Pride events that are happening alongside the main event. We have kind of like community picnics and particularly intersectional events. But these are very small in scale. They kind of have to be, because as soon as they grow, they get into the issues that the main Pride is having. Because here's the thing, in like Plato's perfect form of a Pride, absolutely, we would have no brand sponsorships, we would, as many people who wanted to come would be able to come, we would be able to protest and celebrate together, but unfortunately, we do not exist in the platonic ideal of 2018. So yeah, compromises will have to be made somewhere. I suppose my question is just like, can we get the compromises to be made on the side of the corporations and not on the side of the community? Like maybe asking corporations to make space for LGBTQ+ people at these events, to support the community all year round, to work with non-profits to like genuinely raise their profile. Basically to not just create a massive advert during this parade to sell their products. According to the Financial Times, Reykjavik Pride is doing this now. Sponsors don't have logos on the floats. The logos are on the website. That's something separate. Whether you think the message of Pride should be political or celebratory or supportive or defiant, ultimately, those messages are all lost if all we can see are the shiny lights and logos of companies trying to sell us something. So what do you think? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I'm going to leave a link to my Patreon if you'd like to help support me make these videos, along with links to all my social media, so you can find me all over the internet. And until I see you next time, bye.